Sydney felt like part of Southeast Asia on Sunday. It was unusually hot and humid. But Australia is not a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, so hosting an ASEAN summit was a diplomatic coup for Australia's Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, particularly in the face of the ever-growing power of China and a more isolationist United States. Turnbull wants Australia and ASEAN countries to speak with one voice and says that's what he got.
The countries of ASEAN are among our closest neighbours. They are our friends and increasingly our family as well.
The so-called Sydney Declaration, issued at the end of the summit, commits ASEAN countries to support trade and resist all forms of protectionism. It supports action to address climate change and the full implementation of the Paris Agreement. The declaration stresses grave concerns about the escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, and it commits ASEAN countries to further cooperation on counter-terrorism.
It is essential, it is key, and it is imperative that we have legislations that prevent acts of terrorism rather than just deal with the aftermath.
The declaration also calls for restraint in the South China Sea. Before the summit, some analysts said that one test of the final declaration's strength will be whether it mentioned China as a country by name. This declaration doesn't. Presumably, that was seen as too provocative. But it does emphasise the need for non-militarisation and self-restraint in the South China Sea. Outside the summit venue, there were protests against some of the leaders attending. Australia welcomed Myanmar's Aung San Suu Kyi despite the Rohingya crisis. Vietnam's Prime Minister Nguyen Xuan Phuc was there too, despite human rights abuses in the one-party state. But the biggest protests were against Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen, who has cracked down on opponents and had promised before the summit to find and beat up anyone who burned an effigy of him in Sydney. Protesters did anyway.
The fact that there were protests here is a great sign. A lot of ASEAN countries, when they hold these summits, there are not protests, or they're at such a far distance from the summit site that they can't possibly have an impact.
It's forecast to cool down in Sydney on Monday. By then, most ASEAN leaders will be home. Andrew Thomas, Al Jazeera, Sydney.